Greetings and welcome back to the gallery with me, Robert Cooper, the curator and the host. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview a photographer who I've known for many years, but I just never really knew his story. You know how that goes? Like you see somebody here and there and you guys talk, you know he's a photographer, you know he does great work, but you never really knew or know that person's backstory. The photographer I am talking about is Mr. Richard Lovrich. Now, before this interview, the only thing I really knew about Mr. Lovrich was that he was a very sharp dresser. He hosted an event that my wife performed poetry at, and I knew he was involved with Proctors Theater in Schenectady in some kind of way. Now, if you are interested in learning more about Mr. Lovrich, just sit back and watch this interview.
I'm Richard Lovrich, and for the time being at least, I'm shooting mostly portraits. I got into photography in grammar school, reading photography magazines. That was before I had a camera of any real kind. And I think I was influenced by my father's generation because people had, maybe it was only because of the machine itself. They just looked, I liked the way they looked, and I liked the ability to capture others, I think. And then in high school, I got a little more serious, had a simple camera. Mamiya, I think, was one of my first cameras. And I excelled a little bit, and I ran the photo club and I taught other students photography. So I was a pretty serious photographer already in high school. I was an artist as well. I was an illustrator, and I certainly admired both, but I think it's like a magical quality for me, the ability to freeze time and to capture a person and to capture a moment. Yeah, I think it's just that. To me, it's like a bit of magic. I studied photography along with graphic art at Parsons School of Design, and I had one terrific teacher who was very nuts and bolts, and we saw him once in a while. And then I was part of like a salon class. I think it was something they were experimenting with, and my teacher was Bert Stern, who's one of the pillars of modern advertising photography, and he was amazing. But I learned more about studying about him while I was studying under him, because he was a little inaccessible. He was peculiar, probably high all the time. The last thing Bert Stern ever said to me, we had class one day, we played cards, and then a limousine came and he took us to the Metropolitan Museum, to the Egyptian wing. And he dropped the students off at the Egyptian wing and he was leaving. And he turned around and he said, "Lovrich." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Remember this, poker, mummies." And he walked out. So that was my photography training. His assistant felt so badly because, he took me to lunch and said, "Listen," he said, "you could be teaching a course here on photography and people would get more out of it than you're getting out of it." And then he slipped a little piece of paper across the table at me, and it was an address and a phone number. And I went the next morning and it was a professional photo set up at a restaurant. And the photographer just said, I wasn't even introduced to him. He said, "Hand me those stands," and that's it. That was my introduction into the world of professional photography. Well, let's be clear. Right in school, kind of, I began to work at a professional fashion studio and then did that exclusively. I didn't go back to school. So was that education? Yeah, kind of. I learned by being an assistant. So, it's not exactly formal education. It's not handing in a project, but yeah, it was, because I had to print like full-size prints for the New York Times every day and clean and set up the lighting and do just about everything, including styling at times. So, it's unfair to probably say that I didn't go to school. Oh, I think there are tremendous benefits to the classroom if it's the right classroom, right? If it's just rote, here's a machine and here's how it works, certainly there's some value to that if you haven't picked it up on your own. But I think the thing that you miss if you don't do it in the school setting is the connection to studying, let's say, famous photographers or photographers in this school or that school. And I think that that's a wonderful thing to do. And for me, there was a delay in that, right? I didn't really, except for working under a famous photographer when I was a student, I didn't really reconnect with the world of photographers as artists in a sense for a while. I was very, very immersed in the commercial world. I had my own studio, and then when I moved up to the capital region, in my studio in New York, I did work for, my kids said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Tell people I shoot drugs and do bank jobs." So that's what I did. I worked for drug companies and banks, mostly. I was friends with a very good friend of mine, Richard Lovrich, who's passed, unfortunately. He's from upstate. But anyway, he was living in New York City, and he was the director of a gallery. And the owners were these fabulous old gallery operators, and they had connections with the surrealists at Magritte and with Picasso. And they sold a certain aspect of Andy Warhol's work. And I was honored to be able to hold it, to be with it in that space, which was great. And one day they called me because Andy, I think it was David Byrne, was dating some woman, so she started to gain some notoriety. And I think she was a terrible photographer, actually, but her work was taking kind of dime store, drugstore pictures of people. So she'd have 300 maybe prints just scotch taped to a wall, sort of an artist, taken from different scenes. I didn't find them particularly effective. But anyway, they wanted a picture of Andy in front of her portrait of him. And they had evidently, at Andy's suggestion, they had already hired 4 photographers. This was Architectural Digest, I'm sorry. They had hired 4 photographers, and they had not been able to capture an image that was reproducible. So it was just a casual conversation probably at the gallery, and they said, if you know someone, and they realized, they put like a line in the sand, so it had to be someone Andy approved of. And they said, okay, the person has to shoot it in 4x5. So they figured the person, if they knew how to shoot 4x5, they would know something. And they were right. I was able to take the picture. Andy approved, the gallery called, and they cleared me with him. And I met him, and he was lovely. And the picture came out, but it's not a picture I'm really proud of, because in order to get that weird print to show up, there was a lot of compromise with the lighting. So it's not a photograph that I'm awfully proud of, except for the fact that I got to meet Andy, which was great. And he was very interested in the 4x5, how it worked, how I determined exposure. He asked the right questions about it, technically. And he was more interested than interesting, super interested. I was actually Ted Harden, who I assisted. We were the Honkies, that was our nickname. We worked for Essence magazine. And quite a lot. And so I worked with Beverly Johnson, with Iman, and that to me was like going to church. These people were so remarkable. Beverly Johnson especially. My wife is a terrific makeup artist. Beverly Johnson was the finest makeup artist I've ever seen work. She worked on herself, and she would come in looking from a shower at home, and I'd have to open the studio early for her, and her face would be just perfectly clean. And she was strikingly beautiful already. And then she would erase her face and go down to almost like a kabuki mask of nothing, and then build up the Beverly Johnson that was the first African-American makeup account supermodel, right? And her work was just beautiful. So I was I worked with Susan Taylor. It was just a terrific time, and we were right in it. And again, very lucky period in my life. Going back to my studio days in New York, I worked with a terrific art director for Fairchild Communications, a magazine guy. And unfortunately, budgets started to become crushed. And frankly, my job became far less interesting because I loved working with those other artists. And all of a sudden, I mean, he turned to me and said, listen, they made the decision. I said, why don't I deserve having an art director anymore? He said, it's not that. It's just we all got together and said, you don't need one. And he said, really, you should be an art director. It was the first time I had ever considered changing. And because of changes in my health and some other aspects of things, I agreed, and I started to move in that direction. Started to do some production, some films, then videos for corporations. And then when I moved up here, I moved to upstate New York, but still worked in Manhattan mostly. Fell asleep driving, that was bad. Didn't get hurt, didn't hurt anyone else, thank goodness. And then I started to look for a job locally. So I took a job as night artist at the Times-Union, which was I love the news business. I had worked at Newsweek magazine when I was a kid, right out of high school. So I adored the business, but night artist was not exactly where I wanted to be. But I learned a lot. I learned a lot about it. And in time, I took on some special projects. I think they were suicide missions, basically. But we succeeded, so I became the paper's first art director. So that's when it really took hold. And then I moved from there to become Proctors art director, then creative director. What's the difference those two? I don't know. No, it's a little different, but it really is more of a change of the times than anything else. It's pretty obvious that when you're looking at a black and white photograph, you're left with these just basic sculptural, classical sculptural kind of imagery. And it's less distracting. And it's a bit unfair. In fact, I'm beginning to process them. I've been busy. But the photographs I took of you the other day, I love the way they look. I like the color that they have. But I find color a distraction at times. And it's very pretty. And sometimes it's essential to telling a particular kind of story. It's terrific now I'm probably producing more color work than I've ever done because of the prevalence of fast lenses and powerful cameras, right? Because usually you were taking these golf ball size, grain pictures in color, and I didn't like that look. It was like old 70s movies. I just don't like that look. And so now I feel that more often I can take color pictures that give me that same level of satisfaction that black and white did. So I'm probably doing like 50-50 now. But there are times that what's going on in the image is not served by the colors in the image. And the forms are more important to me. The very first pictures that I took of a person in a studio, I was visiting the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Somebody pulled me out of the line of students and said, you don't need the tour. I said, what do you? He said, you have a camera around your neck, come with me. And we went into a studio. He said, do you know how to use strobes? I said, no. He said, figure it out. So I spent a few minutes playing with them, and he brought in the nude model from the life drawing class. And he said, you have a half hour. And that's how I started, and I stayed in that mode. So I worked with Iman, and I worked with, as an assistant, and I worked with professional models in my studio. So it was actually weird for me to take pictures of people that were not being paid to model for me, and I gave that vibe off. So I wasn't very good at it. And that became a goal for me, to break through that barrier. And once I broke through the barrier, I couldn't look back. So I'm not the most, people will say, never one of my subjects, actually. Someone off to the side will say, don't you think you should ask those people's permission before you start shooting? I say, well, my picture's gone by then, because that's not the picture. My friends know enough to just be completely themselves, but I don't want the selfie type picture. Everybody, as you said before, everybody's so adept at knowing how they look good. This is my good side and I should be smiling. But I find everyone quite beautiful. And they're at their most beautiful when they're vulnerable and when they're just being themselves. So I now had to become this rather impolite person that just starts taking pictures of people. But I hope I give back by, taking people's addresses, sending them pictures of themselves that they will use, and many people do. They'll use them for their profiles or for other reasons. So I do feel that there's a loop there, but my work requires that I sneak up on people, which is, I think, why I shoot with Leicas, because they're slightly friendlier looking too, which is a silly thing to say, but it isn't, because people don't feel as assaulted as they do by a big Nikon or a big Canon, I love the photography of other people. I like supporting other photographers. There's so much work on, let's say, Instagram that's good and great. As far as photography and shows go, you can only feel bad. That's my opinion. You go to a show and the work is so terrible, it's all work you would have thrown away, and that you see no value in it, and you feel terrible. Or you go to a show and it's so beautiful that you know in your heart you could never capture beauty of that kind, and you go home feeling terrible. So it's all about being terrible. Instagram can be that way as well. But yeah, I mean, you've seen it. There are these terrific, the money will always go for the prettiest kind of picture. So now I see a lot of people are having, it's the perfect little pier going out in the water, but I know it's a composition, and they stuck a bird in the sky. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's pretty pictures. I'm much more enamored with a lot of the portrait work and even self-portrait work. Is most of it crap? Of course, but most of everything is crap all the time. That's okay. I always filter out the crap. But I really enjoy Instagram. I can get lost for hours. I have degenerative lung disease, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. My body produces the most important, I think it's the most important anti-inflammatory agent in the body is alpha-1 antitrypsin. And it basically stops an important process that goes on in the body. Otherwise, the body starts to attack itself. And I don't have the ability to stop it. So my body ends up eating, in this case, my lungs. But by the time I was diagnosed, a third of my lungs were already basically destroyed. So I advocate a lot. I do a great deal of volunteer work. I've been across the country, California, Chicago, Florida, Chicago, Portugal, Croatia. Croatia, I was actually the host of the international convention that we had there. So it's rare, so it's very, very important. I'm not the best fundraiser. I'm certainly not a drug researcher. So the one thing I can do is help bring awareness through creative direction. So that's and photography, so I've done quite a lot of that. I was the asshole with the camera for a while. That was my official designation. I could just tell I was annoying people, but I knew, when it's a rare disease, it's not like getting lung cancer when it's like this famous person and they have this and they have this movie star. When you get a rare disease, you realize, wow, if I don't do these things, if I don't take these pictures, they're not going to be taken. If I don't write this story, no one's going to write it. If I don't tell this person's story, no one will help tell this person's story as well. So it does give you an overinflated sense of your worth, but it's in that small environment, it is not overinflated. You do need to pitch in. Proctors did a book of just about all my photography at their 90th anniversary. Because when I worked at Proctors, one of the benefits of hiring me as an art director is that I shoot all the time. So I created quite a wealth of imagery there. Some of it they're still using. All pictures get old eventually, but it's nice to see many years on that they're still using a lot of my photography. But yes, we did a book. I did a book of antiques with someone years ago, but it really wasn't photography that I'm particularly interested in. So the answer is no. I've had a few shows, but never a book.
So yeah, that was Mr. Richard Lovrich. And I had absolutely no idea that he took a picture of Andy Warhol back in the days, nor did I have any idea that he knew Beverly Johnson or that he worked for Essence magazine during their early years. And if you would like to see more of his photography, make sure you follow him at Lovrich on Instagram, and it's spelled Lovrich. Also, make sure you check out his webpage, which is studiolovrich.com. There you can find his book called Have a Very Bad Day, which is a collection of short stories for people who have or are just bad and unlucky people. After you do that, make sure you follow me if you haven't already on Instagram at rcooperphotography, and go to my film page and hit the follow there, and that one is called R. Cooper Shoots Film. And then when you're done with those two, make sure you follow the gallery's page on Instagram, which is R. Cooper The Gallery. Until next time, blessed love.